Now let's take a look at the various Fiori deployment options. Now it's possible to deploy Fiori in two configurations. The first is central hub deployment. It's also sometimes called as a gateway deployment or a standalone server deployment. The another configuration is known as the embedded deployment, and this is the one which is usually recommended by SAP and is the one which will be supported going forward. So let's take a look at the gateway deployment in a bit more detail. Now what happens in the gateway deployment is your Fiori front-end server will run on its own system or on its own separate server, and your backend system will run on a different system, and these two systems will be connected via RFCs. All your UI functionality sits in the front-end system, all your master data, business logic, everything sits in the backend. So you use Fiori front-end as a gateway to access content, and that's why it's also called as a gateway deployment. Now when Fiori was launched in 2013, this was the only available configuration till S4 HANA was launched. After the S4 HANA launch, of course, SAP started supporting the other deployment, embedded deployment, which we'll talk about further. Now some important things to note about this configuration and when you should be using this is, if you are running the old ECC systems and have not yet migrated to S4 HANA, then of course this is the only choice you have. You cannot run embedded configuration if you have the old system and want to use Fiori. Now another scenario where you can use this configuration is when you have multiple systems in your landscape. Let's say you have a SRM system, a ERP system, a BW system, and you want to use Fiori as a front end for all of these systems. You want a one entry point for the user to access the content. So in this case, you can choose to use this as a deployment option, but again, as it stands today, this is not recommended, and the reason is SAP is not really going to support this in the long run. It will be supported throughout this decade, but going forward from 2025, SAP will no longer even launch new Fiori front-end servers which can be deployed in this configuration. So again, the recommended approach is the embedded deployment. Now one of the problems with this approach is your security becomes a little bit more complicated because of the involvement of two systems. And let's take a look at the other deployment option, which is embedded deployment. Now this is the recommended approach as of now. Now what happens in this configuration is your S4 HANA system as well as your Fiori frontend will run on the same server. So and that's why the name embedded. Now again, as I mentioned earlier, this is only possible if you have already migrated to S4 HANA, or if you are migrating to S4 HANA, ECC doesn't support this. So that's like a prerequisite for running embedded deployment. Now one good thing about this, your security, it becomes really easy because you don't have to deal with two systems complexity which is involved in the hub deployment. So that's a really good reason to use this deployment. And then another good reason is the faster UI load, because everything sits on the same server, so you really have fast UI loads, which again is a plus.